Hello. We are with Elaine Mokhtefi, the author of the book Algiers, Third World Capital. This book is a memoir of her life, a life that was marked by the history of the Third World, the anti-racist and anti-colonial movements. Elaine became a privileged witness of the daily construction of what was called Third World. Elaine Mokhtefi, born Klein, was a depression baby. That is how she presents herself in her book. She was born a few years before the big rush into a Jewish family in New York. Throughout her life, she met and became friend of Frantz Fanon and his wife, Josie Fanon, and also friend of Eldridge Cleaver, Kathleen Cleaver, the Black Panthers, and she met another important person at this time as Stokely Carmichael, also from the Black Panthers Party, but Nina Simone, Miriam Makeba. She lived in Algeria, Paris, so she has an excited life. So we are very excited to be able to be with her today to talk about her book and her life. So Elaine, thank you very much for being here with us. So I want to start asking you, when did you become an activist / conscious about the anti-colonial struggle in Africa and Asia? When you met for the first time these kind of movements?
Well, actually, I started in the United States in an organization called the United World Federalists. We were for the creation of a world government. It was just after the Second World War. It was in the 1940s, about 47 or 48, something like that. And at some point, I left the organization and went to Europe. That was in 1951, and I went to France. And in 1952, I had my first real contact with the Algerians, in that I went to the Workers' Day celebration on the 1st of May. And I saw them demonstrating desperately, trying to get into the workers' parade. And I realized then something about colonialism, about the power of a colonial power, to arrest them, to not to do everything in their power not to allow them to express themselves, to express their revendications, their claims to justice, and so on.
Okay, so you lived in Paris 6 years after the Second World War, so, and you worked there as an interpreter, no? Don't you? And you were a French-English interpreter, so you...
I quickly learned French. I knew a little Spanish at the time. I studied Spanish in school and a specialized institute. But I had very little French. And so when I went to Paris, I learned French and became an interpreter and a translator for different international organizations. At the time, there were very few people who spoke more than one language. And really, there was no one in France that was speaking I say no one, but there were so few people who spoke a second language, and especially English.
So, okay, but you told me that you met for the first time in the States, but also in France, in Paris. You met in the 1st May parade, the Algerians. Well, and
my first glimpse of Algeria was in Paris.
Yes, but after, as an interpreter, you could travel around Africa, and you participated in different Pan-African congresses.
Well, I was an interpreter. Mm-hmm. Once I learned French, I became an interpreter and a translator, and so I was there were very few at the time. Okay. Now they're in abundance, but at the time, this was right after the Second World War, there were very few people who were speaking 2 languages. Yeah. And so I was hired as an interpreter and was able to visit these countries. I was able to go to Guinea, to Tanzania, while they were still under colonialism. And the first African country to achieve its freedom was Ghana. And I went to Ghana to organize a Congress for the World Assembly of Youth. And in the process of organizing it, I visited several African countries. And when the conference actually took hold, I met Frantz Fanon. He was stationed in Accra as the representative of the provisional Algerian government in Tunis. Actually, he was accredited as an ambassador to Ghana, but he was actually the roving ambassador of the Algerian fight, the Algerian struggle in all of Africa. And he was stationed in Accra, and he came to the Congress, gave a speech. I met him there.
I met you there. So how can you explain the atmosphere in these meetings in Accra, for example, and how would you describe Frantz Fanon at this moment?
It was an international Congress of Youth. Mm-hmm. And so there were many political resolutions and discussions and jockeying for his position and so on and so on. And Frantz Fanon was present, and there was also an Algerian delegate who was a representative of the students at war. And the three of us sort of became a team. And we're very active in helping people understand different resolutions concerning colonialism and concerning imperialism. And we became fast friends very quickly.
Yes.
Frantz he had already attended the All African People's Congress that was organized in 1958. Mm-hmm. By the Ghanaian government, by Nkrumah. And he had made some very pertinent contacts at the time with Mumia, with Lumumba. He was always a very political personality. It was the goal of his life was to be active politically and to help freedom and justice to engage in politics.
Mm-hmm. When you after your life in Paris, you returned to the States, and you met with Mohammed.
Yes, I met Chandelier. I went to the office, the small office that the Algerian Provisional Government, the FLN. Front de Libération Nationale. Mm-hmm. I had up in New York to lobby the UN for a favorable resolution for Algerian independence. And it was a very small office. There were 4 people. And the French embassy and the French consulate had 100 people in New York lobbying in favor of the war, and it was a really difficult challenge. We worked considerably hard, and politics are a dangerous and fragile game, and the Algerians were sure that that international diplomacy was absolutely necessary for the victory. I mean, they went into this war with Boy Scout knives and rusty old rifles. They knew they had their armament improved, but nevertheless, against the 4th military power of the world, they didn't have much chance. Mm-hmm. So they were very conscious of the need for an international element, an international aspect to their struggle. And so they set up this office in New York. They set up embassies throughout the world, manned by 1 or 2 people, but nevertheless, they were present everywhere. They were present in every international congress, trying to gain resolutions for the victory of the war over France.
Yes, and also you start working there in the International Bureau in 1959 or 1960s, no?
It was 19, yes, in the early 1960s.
Yes.
Algeria became independent in 1962.
Yeah, but it was at this moment, 1960 was an important moment in the international fight for the FLN at this moment. So the work that you did in this international bureau was very important, and at this time.
It was a very militant place to work at the time, and we were very dedicated, and we received journalists and gave interviews. We went to the United Nations. We tried to influence delegations. At the beginning of the first countries to support, of course, Algeria were the Arab countries from the Arab world and countries from the communist world. And it was very difficult to obtain the support of European countries, except Yugoslavia and the what was called the Eastern Bloc. Mm-hmm. De Gaulle at the time, I remember, threatened countries that didn't support, that did support the Algerian struggle, and obviously they were supported by some of the Asian countries like China, Vietnam, and Korea. But it was a tough fight. It was a strong struggle, and we did what we could, and we were very fortunate to have more or less the newspapers like the New York Times and so on that reported on our activities, that reported on the Algerian War and on the small victories that we were obtaining and so on. It was a tough fight.
So
it was very exalting, you know, very exalting.
Yes. So at this time, you became very engaged with the Algerian struggle, and when the independence in 1962, you flew to Algeria, for living there.
Yes, I should mention that every year an Algerian delegation arrived in New York to try to lobby the United Nations, and some of the people who came would become the top leaders of the country for later on. And then in 1962, when Algeria was independent, I went to live there. I'd never been there. I'd worked for the country, it was independence, but I never had set foot in it. So I went to Algeria then. And when I arrived, I remember I arrived on the same plane as a number of representatives of liberation organizations that were fighting also for their independence. People from Angola, people from Mozambique, from South Africa, and so on. And so we sort of teamed up and helped each other.
Wow. So in Algeria, you start working in the government in different jobs as a journalist, as you organized the Pan-African Festival in 1969.
Yes, so before that, one of the principal jobs I had was working for Algeria Press Service, which was their national press agency. And there, I even had occasion to be present the day that a representative came from the Battle of Algiers film company that was making the film, and they came to the National Press Agency and asked if any of us wanted to be in the film that day. And
what's you?
No, actually, I am for about 20 seconds, but it's my
Very
kind
important participation.
Yeah, and there were many organizations that had offices in Algiers at the time. Actually, during the war, and the National Liberation Army had trained freedom fighters from various political organizations, especially in Africa, from different countries, like Zimbabwe, South Africa, Mozambique, Angola, and so on. Nelson Mandela was trained took a training program in 1961 in the Algerian Maquis, and was the first country he visited when 30 years later he was freed. He stood in front of the crowds and said, "I'm Algerian." It was quite an amazing adventure.
Yes. Why do you think that Algiers became a third world capital, a place where all these different liberation movements stay and meet each other there? Why do you think that?
Yes, they were very conscious of the need they had of international assistance, and offered whatever possible to organizations that were fighting imperialism or fascism, even countries like Spain and Portugal, who were under dictatorship at the time, with Salazar and Franco, had organizations, had offices in Algiers to organize against their own leaders. And there were many liberation organizations. Vietnam had a very strong representation, was at war. Vietnam was at war with the United States at the time. And they had a very strong delegation in Algiers. And Algeria opened up to these countries training programs, especially for military people, for freedom fighters. But they also opened up their radio, their television, their publicity outlets, and helped certain organizations, the Palestinians, the South Africans, and so on, with Algerian ID in order to travel, with any kind of lots of possible aids to their struggle. Yeah.
How
it was possible at the time.
How do you think that the Algerian people received all these movements, the liberation movement? I am thinking in the 1969 Pan-African Festival that and all the Algerian people on the streets with different African organizations during this festival. How was it? I don't know, but you lived there, so can you tell us about the spirit of the Algerian people at this moment during the Pan-African Festival? How you can describe this moment with the people on the streets?
I think there's something wrong with the message coming and the picture they're showing, but I think you're asking me about the Pan-African Festival and how it was organized and so on. And when it was a organization of African unity that decided on the holding of a festival, and Algeria offered to sponsor it. was an extraordinary, unique event. I don't think anything like it has been organized since or was organized before. There have been some comparisons with different events in the United States, like Woodstock, for example, but this was an organization of 30, there was present in Algiers, the delegations of independent Africa, 31 nations were there, plus 6 liberation movements, each with national singers, dancers, theater people, writers, politicians who were especially engaged in their national cultures, and so on. It was an absolutely extraordinary event that went on almost 24 hours a day for 2 weeks. I mean, night and day, and Algerian people, women with veils, with their kids, were out there on the streets watching the parades, watching the theatrical performances, watching the singers, watching the dancers. It was absolutely extraordinary.
Wow. And at this moment, in the festival, the Black Panthers party participate in the Pan-African Festival in 1969. I remember Stokely Carmichael participated, but at this moment, Eldridge Cleaver and his wife, Kathleen Cleaver, they just arrived in Algiers.
Yes, they arrived in Algiers. The festival was held at the end of July, and they arrived in June, and they arrived clandestinely. I was informed a few days after they were holed up in a small hotel in Algiers by the representative of the Zimbabwe National Liberation Organization, Charles Chikarema. He told me that he had heard that he had seen Eldridge Cleaver, and that he had arrived clandestinely in Algeria, that he hoped to stay, and would I go see him. So I went the next day and saw him, and introduced his request to the Algerian authorities, to the man in charge of liberation movements for the Algerian government. And he was immediately accepted as a future resident of the country, and as someone who could act politically, who could take advantage of Algerian press services and information services. He can hold a press conference, an international press conference, and so on. He was coming from Cuba, where he lived clandestinely for 5 months. And he was at the time joined by his wife. So he organized, I told him about the festival and spoke to the minister in charge of the organization of the Pan-African Festival. And he was immediately given also an invitation and a certain number of privileges, namely a storefront on one of the main streets of Algiers, where the Black Panthers were able to show their wares, speak to people, have press conferences, and so on. And he had a strong delegation come from the United States to be present at the Pan-African Cultural Festival. And it was a very exciting time. Yeah.
Very. So, you participated or you worked with the international section of the Black Panthers Party in Algiers during the Eldridge Cleaver obtained a village, a house for the Black Panthers embassy in Algiers, and
yes.
start to organize the international section there.
Yeah. the Algerian government turned over the former residents, the former offices of the National Liberation Front of Vietnam to the Black Panther Party. And so they were officially recognized and were able to carry on their activities. I mean, it wasn't easy. I mean, at the time, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have cell phones and so on. It was contact with the United States was much more difficult than it is today. I mean, it was a different era.
So today, in our days, when we talk with, for example, with our students, we talk about the Black Panthers stayed in Algiers for many years, working for the international section. They became very astonished because they for young people in our days it's very strange thinking about Black Panthers in Algeria, for example. It's an strange thing. So how do you explain this context, this reality when you lived in Algeria? How it was possible, this link between this kind of liberation movements?
Yes, and the Black Panthers were able, from the Algerian seat, from their offices in Algeria, to spread their message and make contacts with organizations in Europe that supported them. And to strengthen those contacts, they had they had contacts in England, in Germany, in France, and so on, in Scandinavia. And they strengthened those contacts. From Algeria, Kathleen Cleaver was able to move around and make speeches and visit support organizations. Not only Kathleen, but other Black Panthers. At one point, there were at least 30 people there. It was a very exciting time. I mean, they were. Some of these people who came had come clandestinely also because they were wanted by the U.S. Justice, and of course it was a difficult task in that the organization in the United States was being attacked very heavily and very personally by the FBI at the time. It was a mean fight, a very strong fight, struggle. And it was going on at the time that the Panthers were setting up in Algiers and making contacts throughout the world.
And what did the Panthers know about the Algerian struggle for independence? What did the Panthers, what did they know about Algeria when they?
They knew about Fanon, very, very much so. And they knew about Fanon's activity as an Algerian and with the Algerian struggle. They had read The Wretched of the Earth and White Masks, and Black Faces, that's it, Black Faces and White Masks. And they had been mandatory for all chapters of the BPP, the Black Panther Party, to read. They had discovered, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale had discovered Frantz Fanon, had read his book, and they immediately made it mandatory for all chapters across the United States to read and to learn about Fanon's message.
And the relationship between the Algerian government and the Black Panthers in Algeria was?
Well, it was very good for a while, and it became very difficult at a certain moment because of the fact of the arrival of planes that had been pirated, that had been taken over by militants in the United States and directed towards Algeria with great sums of money for the release of passengers. And at the time, the Black Panthers issued a statement for there were two such planes arriving in Algiers from the United States with large sums of money, one of them $1 million. And at that point, the Black Panthers attacked the Algerian government for giving back the money to the companies, which was normal practice at the time, and forever. Otherwise, they would have been cut out of international air traffic. No international pilot would have landed in Algeria. At any rate, the Black Panthers didn't receive the money. The money was given back, and they complained openly with an international press communique, and that soured relationship. But they were nevertheless kept on. Their monthly stipend was continued to be delivered. Their usage of Algerian property, the house that was their center, their office, and so on, was all maintained, even despite the disagreement of the international press communique.
Okay.
But you must remember too that the Black Panthers at the time in the United States were severely diminished, severely because of FBI activity and because of some of their own faults, and the Panthers in the States being weakened, a split having occurred between Eldridge and Huey Newton. This all contributed to the fact that the Panthers had a diminished role, and finally felt that they should look after themselves as individuals and make decisions concerning their continual struggle and where they would struggle from and how and so on.
Yes, when they finished with the embassy in Algeria, when they left Algeria.
Yes, they left. Individually, they left, one after the other, for different destinations. Some went to Tanzania, some went to Zambia, some went underground in the United States. Eldridge and his family went to France. It was the last ones to leave were the air pirates. For the first airplane that was pirated to Algeria, and they went to France too. Yes. Yes, they entered France. All of them entered France except Kathleen, who had a legitimate passport. All of them went to France undercover, underground, because secretly.
And the Algerian government made the passport for them because they are.
They gave them ID, which allowed them to travel. Some of them. This was, but there were also other avenues for them to receive documents that allowed them to voyage. Yeah. From 69 to 72, when they were, or beginning of 73, when they more or less left, I did work with them in addition to my formal work for the in the Algerian press service, and then in the radio, and so on and so on. And at the university, I was teaching courses in journalism and so on. Yeah, but I mean, I was working and making my own living. I mean, and then on the side, I was working with the Panthers.
No, sure. And you are expelled from Algeria in 1974, and not for your relationship with the Panthers, but for your relationship with your friend at this moment, Sora Salami, the wife of Bemela.
Well, Zora and I worked together on the festival. Zora and I were both part of the team that organized the festival. And we worked in the same office, physically in the same office, and we became fast friends. And I was even she finally married Ben Bello. I was at her wedding, which he was, of course, not present. He was in jail, but he was in prison and house. It was in a house, but it was a prison nevertheless. And yes, we were very, very close.
Mm-hmm. And you are expelled from Algeria for this relationship, no?
Yes, secret police would have liked me to report on her activities. And since I was not accepting to do so, I refused. They tried several times and finally shipped me out.
Mm-hmm. And
but I did go back 44 years later.
Yes, 44 years later. Yes, and what did you find in the new Algeria the recent years when you returned to Algeria? What did you find?
No longer the same country. It was 44 years later. That's almost half a century. And many things had happened, including a civil war that lasted 10 years, dictatorship, corruption, many things that had happened. So that when I went back, it was no longer the same country. And in fact, when I lived there, there were maybe 10 million people. When I went back, there were 40 million, on the way to 50 million. And physically, it was no longer the same. It was a shock. And I didn't feel any energy to change the situation, to improve the situation, to demand. People were closed-mouthed. And that was the first time I went back. But the second time I went back, the Hirak had started, the movement, and people, millions, literally millions, descended into the streets and demanded a change. And they got rid of the president. They were on their way to change. Every week, once a week, every Friday, they would get into the streets and demand in a peaceful way a new leadership, a new constitution, a new agreement between the people for justice, for democracy. And it was very exciting. I marched in that. Perhaps you did too, I don't remember. But I marched twice in that parade while I was there. And it really was very exciting. Of course, it stopped mainly because of the government and military pressure, but also because of the epidemic of the COVID. And now there are signs of a reawakening, and some talk of some demonstrations and some contacts and so on. It's a movement that has remained alive in people's hearts.
Okay. Well, Elaine, I don't know if you want to say another word, but thank you very much for accepting.
Oh, thank you so much, Julieta. It was delightful. I love talking about that period because it was important to me and important to the world.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Yes, very important, because you are a protagonist of a moment, a very important moment for the third world. We are here in Argentina, in South America, so it was a piece of history, very important. We are very, very, very excited to talk about you and to know the history at first hand with all that you are talking with us. So very, very much, Elaine.
Thank you so much for inviting me. And je vous embrasse.